Thank you. And now welcome Monika Jaeckel from Berlin.
Okay. Yeah. This attempts to deal a little bit more with our everyday appliance of touch, or the appliance of touch to everyday devices, which is, I think, common to everybody of us with the touchscreens of phones and tablets. Touch absconding into gesture, or how to become intentionally attuned with distancing devices. In the beginning of her book Migrations of Gesture, Carrie Nolan cites Theodor Adorno concerns brought forward about 60 years ago. What does it mean for the subject that there are no more casement windows to open, but only sliding frames to shove, no portals to close discreetly, but only doors to be slammed? Nolan continues, referring to Adorno's thought in respect of what would it mean if modern subjects learn to slam and shove rather than latch and release. How will the general experience of movement be transformed? Asking what does it mean for the subject if under the sway of advanced technology, only gestures precise and brutal may be executed within the modernist regime, Nolan points out Adorno's insight that both instrumental and communicative gestures encode, express, and perpetuate the values of specific historical and cultural formations. Coming across this only after having sent my proposal, I felt a certain increase of my already present unease that surrounded my thinking about touch as absconding into gesture. It seemed a demanding task involving questions of what touch is, what is a gesture, and how do these relate to each other and to movement. Adorno's position appeared not too far from my own conception, just that the questions now concerns the situation of the postmodern, if not posthuman subject, and it is not so much about slamming of traditional doors, but the wiping gestures on glass or plastic screens, or even muscular prostheses as gestural devices. Another difficulty arose from how to address the theme critically without sounding rather nostalgic. But meanwhile, in fact, it is the quite popular field of cognitive neuroscience itself that emphasizes the role of the acting body and of sensory motor systems in constituting the way our mind represents reality by shaping our cognitive schemas. Furthermore, authors like Karen Barat, whose work addressed the intersections of matter, ring, and meaning, or the concept of plasticity that Catherine Malabou, who attempts to define that plasticity takes over and becomes the resistance of difference to its textual reduction, provide new access points to the theme. But let's depart from my initial inquiry. What do we touch when we touch a touchscreen? This question leads to the point, in which way does it matter when touch becomes a gestured instruction language, as this is how our computer-oriented movements seem to be developing into? What exactly happens when touch, which is generally defined as motion-related, first becomes gestural and then further absconds into gestures to be read out by digital prosthetic devices, which then redirect or provide a kind of responsiveness through the initiated process? Touching in the sense of moving the other or the self in the other by touching on environmental outlets and boundaries is bound to a certain response, which is not only expected but certainly needed to recognize the self. Reciprocity of recognition is crucial for interaction, a statement by Merleau-Ponty, to which Vasudevi Reddy refers in her article, Moving Others Matters. Also, as Jack Reynolds has pointed out, characterizing this reversibility as immanent, as I did in my abstract, is simply incorrect, as the world and others are conceived of always already encroaching on the body. This describes that the experience of touching is dependent on the recognition of simultaneous tangibility, which establish our embodied subjectivity at the intersection of two lines that in a chiasmic structure of overlapping and encroachment nevertheless retains a divergence. Based on these insights, and congruently due to the necessary difference Derrida has pointed out, Barat speaks of an infinite authority that all touching entails. Touching the other is touching all others, including the self, and touching the self entails touching the strangers within. So then, what or who do we touch when we touch the surface of a smart device? Do we already touch an inhuman other? Or is it simply a tool, an extension that allows us to get in touch with one another? Under the premise that our touch needs the sensing, the tactility that is the response of matter, or else constituting mattering, what is exactly the response we get when touching a screen? Which density or structure do we sense? Which implications and connotations come with it? It is certainly at least twofold information we receive. We touch a surface, nevertheless we expect and accept a very different reaction. One that ignores the central affectivity and follows a coded redirect to create the desired affect, transmitting into cognitive affect that happens outside of our own cognitive processing. While the activity still seems to almost adhere to the literal translation of the statement that touch moves and affects what it affects, it might be questioned whether this way of touching can still be accounted for the way of fundamental central experience of world recognition which touch has been ascribed to. Paul Durisch defines the interaction with digital devices as a form of mediated communication between the end user and the system designer. Thus, he concludes that even the most isolated and individual interaction with the computer system is still fundamentally a social activity, taking place against the backdrop of commonly held social understandings. Not touched, so why these practices keep us intentionally attuned? Touching has an intimacy, and interestingly, the statement, "it is so much more intimate than a laptop," I think, as I heard, this doesn't work here, but so I can just have him running. It's, oh, sorry, 20 seconds only. But one can find that on YouTube. Was one of the first sentences Steve Jobs said in this first presentation of the iPad. It's fine, it's over soon. So did he mean the intimacy implied by the touch screen or tablet of a personal space that connects to a remote outside, suggesting certain allowances that certainly are also included by the proprietorial portability of the device? It indicates a shared space which fosters a sense of intimacy, of agency. So Lucy Suchman early on stated that mutualities are not necessarily symmetries. Humans and artifacts do not appear to constitute each other in the same way. Already in the same paper from 2000, Suchman refers to Barat's definition of responsibility and situatedness as not to be an arbitrary construction of our choosing, but because it is sedimented out of particular practices that we have a role in shaping our world. This means also that if we are not aware of our practices, but mistake a device for the enacted activity it forms in an apparatus-like engagement with us, as expressed in Barat's definition of agential realism, the inherent response and responsibility stays unacknowledged. Barat's term of space-time mattering defines worlding as the experience out of a situated action. And Judith Butler adds that all action requires support. Indeed, actions are always situated in particular social and physical circumstances. Therefore, the situation is crucial to action's interpretation, emphasizes Suchman, focusing on the interaction with technological devices. It is thus not the touching of a touchscreen, but the social and material constitution surrounding it, which we relate to. Consequently, our touch is a directed or supported one, which brings it close to gesture. The action, so, is barely reciprocated, not touched upon in any implied connotation. Nevertheless, the device itself acts as an augmentation of action that partly occurs outside our own cognition and perhaps other mental processes, as Mark Rowland suggests for a vision of cognition, and this is quoting, as something that organisms achieve in part because of what they do in and to the world that is outside their brains, whether their bodies or the wider environments. The problematic so lies in the inherent coded redirect that, due to the circumstances of the device's fabrication, entails and transports further definitions of information/action, which we get in touch with as simulated responsiveness. In his book, The Tacit Dimension, Michael Polanyi has described the semantic shift from the proximal, that is the close, to the distal, the distant, in our tacit knowing that we allocate the meaning of a tool's impact on our hands in terms of its effect on the things to which we are applying it. The redirected touch also becomes distal on the basis of this immanent semantic shift and might be considered as becoming structural gestural. Direct touch, though, can entail gestural motion, but generally gesture has to be seen as a component of human utterance that, as Adam Kendon states, has to be regarded as embedded and part of the action systems by which the environment and objects within it are manipulated, modified, organized, and created. End of quote. Thus, defining our gestures with which we seem to activate the tactile devices as a gestural language of instructions in the sense of a system of abstract symbols fails to understand the intentional attunement with which the distal effectuations of digital technology affect us. So then, what in fact is a gesture? David McNeill defines gesture and language as interdependent and coexistent. Gesture and speech are, according to him, a way of cognitively existing, of cognitively being at the moment of speaking. Both are the thought coming into being at that instant. McNeill implies that the actual motion of gesture itself is a dimension of meaning, not an expression or representation of it, but is it. This contention references Merleau-Ponty's point that language, rather than presenting, is the subject's taking up of a position in the world of his meanings. A position quite similar to Wittgenstein's assertion that is, the meaning of a word is its use in the language. It is the performativity of speech, and I insert gesture, that Judith Butler expressed in a recent talk when gesture becomes event, in the remark that not only we act on speech, but also speech acts on us. So certainly Butler addressed with this insight a wider frame. Nevertheless, it allows returning to the observation of neuroscientific research. Vittorio Gallese states that due to the workings of the mirror neurons, an interactive encounter is not about unaffectedly seeing an action, an emotion, or a sensation, but that observed social stimuli, internal representations of the body states associated with these actions, emotions, and sensations are evoked in the observer, and thus create a space of intersubjectivity. The studies Gallese refers to show that speech and symbolic gesture share the same brain mechanisms of sensorimotor motor control, thus creating a relationship between hand, expressive gesture, and language. Both now regarded as cognitive tools and employed to organize, elaborate, and self-consciously structure our own social experiences under the aspects in the domain of intersubjectivity. The shift from the metaphor of the window of the desktop computers towards a sense of intimate space that through sliding and wiping is moved, hence occurs in the seeming consequence and congruence with the neuroscientific insights. The gestures of touching and holding touchscreens seems to enhance the idea that it is a personal space, as the sense of tactile or haptic intimacy links to cognitive models where the whole self is explored. In Gallese's words again, the same systems running our body in the world not only provide structure to conceptual content, but also contribute to the characterization of the semantic content of concepts in terms of the way we function with our bodies in the world. And coming to a conclusion, so while empathy is based on intentional attunement that collapses the other's intentions into the observer's ones, producing the peculiar quality of familiarity we entertain with other individuals, it is the shareability of the phenomenal content of the intentional relations of others by means of their shared neural underpinnings, from which our intentional attunement evolves. The initial question thus morphed into the one, what happens when touch becomes a gesture? And that is now a wiping move that blurs the actual situatedness into distal knowing, which in fact is an inward turn. A very small study, I think it's not relevant, but had some interesting outcome, which looked strictly at gestural device instruction, said that when communicating with technology, participants on average use less taut handshakes. This decreased tautness may be a result of egocentric manner. Inward focus of gesturing is reported by some participants, quoting from that paper. An outcome in a turn to the instrumentalization of gesture that recalls Agamben's statement, the more gestures lose their ease under the action of invisible powers, the more life becomes indecipherable. Agamben describes the inward turn of the Western bourgeois at the end of the 19th century as a consequence of the irretrievable loss of gestures, which relates to an understanding of gesture in which potential and action, nature and artifice, contingency and necessity become indiscernible. It is the general incalculability of responsiveness that attunes us intentionally, even in its calculable machinic performance, which kids so intuitively are able to grasp. Children seem instinctively to understand the potential of tactile devices, but also the limits of responsibility they have. You can't make it come alive, is how the journalist Paula Kokotza cites a 6-year-old digital native. Barat defines the incalculable responsibility of the world's ongoing interactive becoming and not becoming, and enabling through the iterative reworking of im/possibility as the infinite authority that lives in, around, and through us. This also concerns the body in its affective cognitivity that not only structures the experiential aspects of intersubjectivity, but also their linguistic representations and our gestures. For Agamben, a gesture neither represents solely a sphere of means as addressing a goal, nor a superior sphere of movement that has its ends in itself. The mediality a gesture exhibits, he states, is the process of making means visible as such. The gesture thus interrupts the very being means of being in language, and shows just the very fact of it, thereby transforming a res into a res gesta. So if endured and supported, allowing the emergence of this exact being in a medium opens an ethical dimension that is also an option entailed in Barat's term of responsibility, evoked by touching. That's it.